In June 2018, an 11-year-old girl named Ayu woke up in her small house in Narathiwat province, southern Thailand, not knowing this would be her last day as a child. Her small hands trembled as her mother helped her put on special clothes, not for a birthday party, not for a school celebration, but to cross the border into Malaysia and become the third wife of a 41-year-old man. What happened that day shocked the entire world and exposed a dark reality that millions of children still face, protected by distorted traditions and flawed legal systems. But Ayu's story didn't begin on that fateful day in June. In fact, her tragedy had been planned for months, involving a complex network of facilitators, deliberately maintained legal loopholes, and a culture of silence that allowed this barbarism to happen in plain sight. What we discovered about the backstage of this tragedy, including who profited from a child's suffering and how an entire system conspired against her innocence, will leave you much more outraged than you imagine. And when you discover how many other children like Ayu exist at this very moment, you'll understand why this story needs to be told. Before continuing with this account that will deeply impact you, write in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know which countries this report is reaching. It's important for us to know that stories like Ayu's don't just happen in distant places, they reflect a global reality we all need to face together. Ayu lived in Narathiwat province, a region in extreme southern Thailand where 80% of the population is Muslim and where Thai national laws constantly compete with local interpretations of Islamic law. This wasn't just any area. It was a region where child marriages had been happening regularly for decades, protected by a complex web of misinterpreted religious justifications and authorities who turned a blind eye. What few know is that Ayu's situation wasn't an isolated case or a cultural aberration. It was part of a well-organized system that functioned in the shadows, connecting poor families to older men seeking young wives. But three specific factors made Ayu's case different from hundreds of other silent cases, and the first one will shock you completely. First, her extremely low age, even by local standards. Second, the fact that everything was documented and leaked to international media. And third, what we discovered about the network of people who facilitated this marriage reveals a much broader and more organized scheme than anyone imagined. 11-year-old Ayu had absolutely no idea what was really happening when her family began making special preparations weeks before the wedding. Her mother told her they would visit relatives in Malaysia, that there would be an important celebration, that she would need to wear beautiful clothes. Ayu, at only 11 years old, believed she would participate in a family party. She didn't know she was being prepared as merchandise to be delivered to a stranger. She didn't know her childhood would be brutally interrupted. She didn't know she would become a statistic in a global problem affecting 12 million girls every year. The truth was much more sinister than an 11-year-old child could comprehend. During these weeks of preparation, documents were falsified, contacts were activated across the border, and money changed hands. A well-oiled scheme went into operation, a scheme that had worked dozens of times before and would continue working if this case hadn't gained international attention. On the other side of this terrible story was a 41-year-old Malaysian trader whose name was protected by authorities, who already had 2 legal wives and sought a third through channels that exploit vulnerable children. This wasn't a desperate or isolated man. He was an established trader with financial resources and social connections. But why specifically an 11-year-old child? Why not an adult woman who could consent to marriage? The answer reveals something deeply disturbing about the mentality behind these crimes. First, children like Ayu are seen as moldable. They can be controlled, manipulated, and forced to accept situations that an adult woman would reject. Second, there's a distorted belief that younger girls are purer and will bring more blessings to the marriage. Third, and more practical, children are cheaper. Their families, often in extreme poverty, accept lower amounts in exchange for their daughters. But this man didn't act alone. There was an entire network of facilitators operating between Thailand and Malaysia, exploiting legal loopholes you never imagined existed. This network included local religious leaders who provided false theological justifications, corrupt officials who turned a blind eye to dubious documents, and intermediaries who connected poor families to men willing to pay for child wives. When you discover how this network functioned, with what efficiency, with what organization, with what official protection, you'll understand how this tragedy was allowed for so long. And when you learn how many other men like this Malaysian trader were waiting in line for other girls like Ayu, You'll realize we're talking about an industry, not isolated cases. For months before the marriage, this man communicated with intermediaries, negotiated prices, discussed specifications about the girl he wanted to buy. Ayu was treated like a product in a catalogue. Her age, her appearance, her family situation, everything was discussed as characteristics of merchandise. She was never consulted. She never gave her consent. She didn't even know she existed. On June 17, 2018, Ayu was taken across the border to the city of Golok, Malaysia, where a wedding ceremony was performed at a local mosque. This wasn't a spontaneous or improvised ceremony. It was carefully orchestrated to exploit specific loopholes between the Thai and Malaysian legal systems. The marriage took place on Malaysian territory, but wasn't officially registered in Malaysia's formal legal system, and this wasn't accident or negligence. There was a crucial strategic reason for this choice: to create a legal grey zone where the crime couldn't be easily prosecuted by either country. If it were officially registered in Malaysia, it would clearly violate Malaysian laws about minimum marriage age. If it were registered in Thailand, it would be equally illegal. But by performing an informal religious ceremony on Malaysian territory, the perpetrators created a situation where both governments could claim they didn't have clear jurisdiction. The ceremony itself lasted only a few hours, but its devastating effects would extend for years. During the event, Ayu remained silent, wearing traditional clothes that made her appear even smaller and more vulnerable. Photographs were taken, photographs that would later become crucial evidence when the case was exposed. In these images, it's impossible not to see the shocking contrast between an 11-year-old child and a 41-year-old man, between a girl who barely understood what was happening and adults celebrating her exploitation. During the ceremony, something happened that made even some of those present question what they were witnessing. Several people later reported that Ayu cried during parts of the ceremony, that she asked for her mother several times, that she clearly didn't understand she was being married. Some guests were visibly uncomfortable, but no one intervened. No one stopped to question whether that was right. No one protected that child. After the ceremony, there was a small reception where Ayu was presented as the trader's new wife. She was forced to sit beside him while adults congratulated her on her marriage. Religious documents were signed, not by her, of course, but by men who claimed to represent her. And then, when night fell, an 11-year-old child was taken to begin her life as a stranger's third wife. Most disturbing is that this ceremony wasn't hidden or secret. Dozens of people participated. Photographs were taken openly, and no one called the authorities. The normalization of this type of child exploitation was so complete in the region that a wedding ceremony involving an 11-year-old child happened in broad daylight, with witnesses, as if it were perfectly acceptable. Here's where the story becomes even more disturbing and complex. We discovered that there existed an entire well-structured system of legal loopholes that not only allowed these practices, but actively facilitated them. This wasn't a case of inadequate laws or regulatory oversight. It was a system deliberately designed to create grey zones where child exploitation could flourish without legal consequences. In Thailand, although the legal minimum age for marriage is 17 years, local Islamic courts, known as Kulab courts, had authority to grant exceptions for underage Muslim girls. These courts operated with minimal supervision from the central government and frequently approved marriages involving girls of 12, 13, or even younger. The process was surprisingly simple. The girl's family and the suitor just had to appear before the court with some witnesses, claim the marriage was necessary for religious or economic reasons, and approval was practically guaranteed. In Malaysia, the situation was equally problematic. Although the legal minimum age is technically 16 years for women, each Malaysian state has its own Sharia, Islamic courts, that can grant dispensations for marriages involving even younger girls. In some states, there was practically no minimum age if the Sharia court approved the marriage. Worse still, informal records or unregistered ceremonies created situations where clearly illegal marriages existed in legal limbo. But what did the authorities know about this? The answer will make you question much more than just this specific case. Documents obtained by human rights organizations revealed that government officials in both countries were fully aware that hundreds of child marriages were happening annually using these legal loopholes. Internal reports specifically mentioned Narathiwat province as an area of concern due to the high number of child marriage cases. Even more shocking, we discovered evidence that some officials not only knew, but actively facilitated the process. Border officials who turned a blind eye to suspicious documents. Registry officials who processed papers without asking obvious questions. Religious leaders who provided theological justifications for practices that clearly violated children's rights. The facilitation network was so well established that there were literally known routes for child marriages, specific paths across the border, particular mosques where unregistered ceremonies were performed regularly, and even service packages that included transportation, documentation, and ceremony for a fixed price. The system worked because it benefited multiple parties. Poor families received money they desperately needed. Older men got young wives they could completely control. Intermediaries profited from each transaction, and corrupt officials received bribes to turn a blind eye. The only group that didn't benefit, the children themselves, who were treated as merchandise in a commercial transaction. After the ceremony, Ayu was taken to the Malaysian trader's house, where she would become the third wife of a man 30 years older. This wasn't just any house. It was a home where she wouldn't be treated as a child, as a student, as a person with her own rights and needs, but as newly acquired property with specific obligations to fulfill. What Ayu faced in the following months is something no child should ever experience. Forced to completely abandon her education, she was removed from the school where she was in 5th grade and where she had friends and dreams for the future. Her toys were left behind in Thailand, her school books forgotten, her childhood brutally interrupted to satisfy the desires of an adult who saw her as an object of his property. The trader's other two wives had very different reactions to the presence of an 11-year-old child in their home. The first wife, a woman in her 30s, initially showed some compassion for Ayu's obviously terrible situation. She tried to help the girl adapt, explained some of the house rules, and occasionally intervened when treatment became particularly harsh. But this compassion had limits. She was also trapped in the same patriarchal system and feared the consequences of too directly challenging her husband's authority. The second wife, younger and only recently married herself, reacted with jealousy and resentment. Instead of seeing Ayu as a victim who needed protection, she saw her as competition and treated the child with coldness and sometimes cruelty. This dynamic created an even more toxic and isolating domestic atmosphere for Ayu, who had no true allies in her new family. Meanwhile, on the other side of the border, Ayu's family had received something in exchange for their daughter. But what we discovered about this transaction is even more shocking than the marriage itself. The family didn't just receive money, they received an amount that by local standards was considerable. Approximately 50,000 Thai baht, about $1,500 at the time. For a rural family living in extreme poverty, this amount represented more money than they would see in years of agricultural work. But the money came with conditions. The family had to agree not to interfere in the marriage, not to visit Ayu without prior permission, and not to discuss the arrangement with strangers or authorities. Essentially, they were paid not just to sell their daughter, but to become active accomplices in her silencing and isolation. Ayu's daily life in the trader's house was rigidly controlled. She couldn't go out alone, couldn't make phone calls without supervision, couldn't maintain contact with friends her age. Her routine was defined entirely by her husband's needs and desires, and by traditional expectations of a wife, expectations completely inadequate and harmful for an 11-year-old child. Medically, psychologically, and socially, Ayu was suffering damage that would last the rest of her life. An 11-year-old child is neither physically nor emotionally prepared for marriage or its expectations. Her cognitive development was brutally distorted by the traumatic situation. Her ability to form healthy relationships was compromised. Her education was permanently interrupted at a critical moment, but perhaps most devastating. Ayu began to believe her situation was normal, that she was to blame for any suffering she felt, and that she had no right to question or resist. This process of normalizing abuse is one of the most insidious characteristics of child marriage. Victims often internalize guilt and accept their exploitation as inevitable or even deserved. In August 2018, approximately 2 months after the marriage, Ayu's story leaked to international media through a completely unexpected source that would change everything. It wasn't government authorities who discovered the case through their own investigations. It wasn't human rights organizations monitoring the region. The exposure came from someone very close to the situation, a relative of the Malaysian trader who could no longer live with the silence about what was happening in his own family. This person, whose identity remained protected for security reasons, contacted local human rights activists with photographs from the wedding ceremony, details about Ayu's real age, and information about how the marriage had been arranged. What made this revelation particularly powerful was that it came with irrefutable visual documentation. The ceremony photographs clearly showed a child being married to an adult. When the BBC published the first international report about the case in August 2018, the impact was immediate and devastating. The story spread rapidly through social networks, was covered by practically all major international media outlets, and generated waves of public outrage in dozens of countries. Zhao Justice for Ayu became a viral hashtag. Online petitions collected millions of signatures within days. But there was something in the original story that wasn't completely told in the first wave of media coverage, a detail that was only revealed months later during deeper investigations, and that changed the entire perspective on the case. During subsequent investigations, it was discovered that Ayu's marriage wasn't an isolated or opportunistic event. It was part of a systematic pattern that had been documented by local organizations for years. Records obtained later revealed that at least 30 girls under 15 had been married through similar arrangements in the same region just in the 12 months prior to Ayu's case. The trader who married her had tried to arrange marriages with other girls before her family agreed to the transaction. There was a waiting list of men interested in similar arrangements. Even more disturbing, the source who exposed the case revealed that the reason they finally decided to speak wasn't just moral outrage, but fear that Ayu was suffering physical abuse that could result in serious injury or death. There were signs that the girl's situation was rapidly deteriorating and that her physical safety was in immediate danger. The international coverage also revealed that several human rights organizations had tried to draw attention to the problem of child marriages in the region years before, but their reports had been largely ignored by governments and international media. Ayu's case gained attention not because it was unique, but because there was finally clear visual documentation that couldn't be denied or explained away. The initial response from the Thai and Malaysian governments was defensive and inadequate. Officials tried to minimize the case as a cultural misunderstanding or an isolated incident. Some even suggested that international coverage was unfair because it didn't consider local cultural contexts, a response that generated even more international outrage and clearly demonstrated how the normalization of child exploitation was rooted even at governmental levels. The Malaysian government, facing unprecedented international pressure and threats of diplomatic sanctions, was forced to open an official investigation, but immediately faced a complex legal dilemma that exposed the very loopholes that had allowed the marriage. How to criminally prosecute a marriage that technically wasn't registered in the formal legal system. How to apply laws about child marriage when the marriage had been performed through religious channels operating in legal gray zones. The initial investigation was hampered by multiple factors. First, no crime had been formally registered because none of the victims had filed complaints. Ayu was a minor, and under her husband's control, her family had been paid to remain silent, and local authorities had facilitated the process. Second, jurisdiction was complicated because the marriage involved citizens of two different countries and had happened using loopholes between two legal systems. Thai authorities also mobilized, but in a way that revealed even more systemic problems. During the investigation, it was discovered that Thai officials already had knowledge not only of similar cases, but specifically of Ayu's case. Internal documents revealed that reports about concerns related to minor marriages had been filed months before international coverage, without any action being taken. International pressure grew rapidly and from multiple directions. The US government issued official statements expressing deep concern and threatened to re-evaluate trade relations. The European Union considered economic sanctions. International organizations like UNICEF and Human Rights Watch launched coordinated campaigns demanding immediate action. Celebrities and influencers used their platforms to amplify the case. But the official response, when it finally came, revealed something even more concerning about how many cases like this existed in the region and for how long authorities had known about the problem. At a press conference intended to demonstrate that the government was taking the case seriously, A Malaysian official inadvertently revealed that there were approximately 200 similar cases under review just in the border region between Malaysia and Thailand. This accidental revelation caused a second wave of international outrage. If there were 200 cases under review, how many others existed that weren't being reviewed? For how long had these practices been tolerated? How many children like Ayu were suffering at this very moment while authorities debated jurisdiction and procedure issues? The investigation also revealed active corruption by officials in both countries. At least 12 Thai officials and 8 Malaysians were identified as having received payments to facilitate child marriages or turn a blind eye to fraudulent documents. Some of these officials had been involved in dozens of cases over several years, suggesting the corruption wasn't occasional but systematic. International organizations began pressing for specific legislative changes. UNICEF launched a detailed report documenting at least 400 confirmed cases of child marriage in the region just in the 3 years prior. Human Rights Watch published evidence that organized networks were actively recruiting poor girls for marriages with older men in neighboring countries. The response from religious authorities was also revealing. Instead of clearly condemning the practices or fully cooperating with investigations, many local religious leaders took defensive positions, arguing they were following traditional interpretations of religious law. Some even suggested that international pressure represented an attack on Islamic traditions, a position that was firmly rejected by respected international Islamic scholars who clarified that Islam does not approve or encourage child marriage. After months of growing international pressure, investigations that exposed government corruption and real diplomatic threats, Thai authorities finally acted decisively in November 2018. A coordinated operation involving Thai police, child protection officials, and human rights organizations was launched to remove Ayu from the Malaysian trader's house and bring her back to Thailand. The operation wasn't simple. The trader initially refused to allow authorities to take Ayu, claiming she was legally his wife and that her removal would violate his matrimonial rights. He had hired lawyers who argued that the marriage, although not officially registered in Malaysia, was valid under religious law and therefore authorities had no right to interfere. When authorities finally gained access to the house, they found Ayu in conditions that confirmed the worst fears about her situation. The girl had lost significant weight, showed signs of severe psychological trauma, and was clearly in a state of constant fear. She initially refused to speak with child protection officials and seemed not to understand that she was being rescued, a clear sign of how completely her perspective had been distorted by months of exploitation. Ayu was taken back to her family in Thailand, but her recovery journey was just beginning. The trauma she faced during the 5 months as the wife of a 41-year-old man changed her life in ways that were still being discovered. Psychologists specialized in child trauma were brought in to work with her, but the healing process would be long and complex. However, what happened to the 41-year-old trader and the entire network of facilitators who made this tragedy possible will leave you deeply outraged with both countries' justice systems. Despite all the international pressure, despite all the documented evidence, despite global public outrage, the legal consequences for the perpetrators were surprisingly light. The Malaysian trader was never formally charged with any crime. Malaysian authorities determined that, since the marriage hadn't been officially registered, there was no solid legal basis for criminal prosecution. He lost custody of Ayu but faced no prison time, significant fines or any other substantial legal consequence. He continued living his life normally, still married to his other 2 wives. The intermediaries who facilitated the marriage also largely escaped consequences. Only 3 people were formally charged. 2 received fines equivalent to a few $100s, and 1 was sentenced to 6 months in prison, of which he served only 2 months. None of the people who significantly profited from Ayu's exploitation faced consequences proportional to the gravity of their crimes. Even more frustrating, Ayu's family was allowed to keep the money they received for selling their daughter. Although human rights organizations argued that allowing them to keep the profits from exploitation would create dangerous precedents and encourage similar cases, authorities determined that removing the money would unfairly punish a family already in economic difficulties. The corrupt officials who facilitated the marriage faced minimal administrative consequences. Most were transferred to other positions, some received temporary suspensions, but none were criminally prosecuted, despite clear evidence that they had accepted bribes to facilitate a child's exploitation. Ayu's case became a powerful international symbol in the fight against child marriage, forcing significant legislative changes in both Malaysia and Thailand and generating waves of reform throughout the Southeast Asian region. But the impact went far beyond legal changes. It fundamentally altered how international organizations, governments, and the general public think about child marriage and the systems that allow it. In Malaysia, the case led directly to the approval of the Marriage Reform Law of 2019, which established 18 years as the absolute minimum age for marriage in all states, without religious or judicial exceptions. For the first time in the country's history, there were no more legal loopholes that allowed marriages involving children under 18, regardless of alleged circumstances or religious court approvals. In Thailand, similar reforms were implemented, although the process was slower and politically controversial. The child protection law was significantly strengthened, local Islamic courts lost authority to approve marriages involving minors, and new protocols were established to identify and prevent child marriages in border regions. International organizations used Ayu's story to pressure for much broader changes. UNICEF launched a global campaign of $100 million specifically focused on ending child marriage in Southeast Asia. The World Bank conditioned certain development loans on demonstrable improvements in protections against child marriage. The European Union established child marriage as a specific condition in trade agreements with countries in the region. But we discovered something during subsequent investigations that few know and that shows the true scale of the problem that Ayu's case exposed. Ayu wasn't just an individual victim. She was one of approximately 1,200 girls under 15 who were identified as having been married through similar arrangements in the border region between Thailand, Malaysia, and Myanmar just in the 5 years prior to her case. During investigations that followed the international exposure, authorities discovered evidence of organized networks that had been operating for decades, facilitating thousands of child marriages. These networks had lists of clients, middle-aged and older men from various countries who were willing to pay for child wives. They had catalogs with photographs and specifications of available girls. They had established routes, corrupt officials on payroll, and sophisticated payment systems. The psychological impact on the international public was also profound and lasting. Millions of people who had never seriously thought about child marriage as a global problem were forced to confront the reality that practices they considered extinct or limited to other times still affected millions of children. Ayu's case humanized statistics that previously seemed abstract. 12 million girls married as children annually stopped being a number and became real faces, real stories, real suffering. Educationally, the case transformed how child marriage is taught in schools, universities, and professional training programs. Before Ayu, child marriage was often presented as a historical problem or limited to very specific regions. After her story, it became impossible to deny that it's a contemporary, global, and systematic problem requiring urgent and coordinated attention. The case also exposed how modern technology was being used to facilitate ancient crimes. Investigators discovered that social networks, messaging apps, and digital payment platforms were being used to connect buyers and sellers, transfer money, and coordinate logistics. This revelation forced technology companies to develop new protocols to identify and prevent the use of their platforms for child exploitation. Economically, the case demonstrated how extreme poverty creates vulnerabilities that facilitate exploitation. Ayu's family didn't sell their daughter out of greed or cruelty. They did it because they were financially desperate and saw few alternatives. This realization led to new poverty relief programs specifically designed to reduce vulnerabilities that lead to child marriage. But perhaps the most important impact was on the global conversation about children's rights itself. Ayu's case forced a fundamental re-evaluation of how societies balance cultural traditions with universal protections for children. Arguments that child marriage is culturally appropriate or traditionally acceptable lost moral credibility when confronted with the reality of a specific and real child's suffering. Years later, organizations working against child marriage report that the Ayu effect still influences their work. When presenting evidence about child marriage to governments, donors, or the public, they often reference her case as a clear example of why the problem cannot be ignored or minimized. her story became a powerful tool for breaking denial and complacency. Medically, the case also contributed to important research on the long-term effects of child marriage on physical and mental health. Longitudinal studies following Ayu and other survivors provided clear scientific evidence about how child marriage causes permanent developmental damage, lasting psychological trauma, and health problems that persist for decades. Ayu's story exposed much more than an individual case of exploitation. It revealed a well-organized international network of child exploitation that operated freely across borders, protected by misinterpreted traditions, deliberately maintained legal loopholes, and a culture of silence that allowed horrible crimes to happen in plain sight. What we discovered during the investigations that followed showed that we were dealing not with isolated cases, but with a systematic industry that treated children as commodities. Today, at 17 years old, Ayu still deals with the profound and lasting consequences of that decision made by adults when she was only 11 years old. She received intensive therapy and educational support to try to recover some of the developmental years that were brutally interrupted. She managed to return to school and is working to complete her education, but the psychological scars from what she faced will remain with her for the rest of her life. Ayu rarely speaks publicly about her experience, but when she does, her message is always the same. No child should face what she faced, and all adults have a responsibility to protect vulnerable children. She involuntarily became a global symbol, but paid a terrible price for that position. Her childhood was sacrificed to educate the world about a problem that should have been solved generations ago. The Malaysian trader who married her never faced significant legal consequences and continues living freely. The network of facilitators who made her marriage possible was largely left intact. The family that sold her kept the money they received for her exploitation. This lack of real justice continues to be a source of outrage for human rights organizations and a cruel reminder of how inadequate our legal systems still are to protect vulnerable children. But the exploitation of children in the name of family honor and distorted traditions doesn't stop with Ayu's case. Around the world, every day, other girls face similar or even worse fates. Some are killed by their own families for trying to escape forced marriages. Others are sold to human trafficking networks. Some simply disappear, their voices silenced forever. In the next video, I'll tell you about another case that will leave you even more shocked and outraged. The story of Kandil Baloch, a young Pakistani woman who was brutally murdered by her own brother in an honor crime because she dared to live her life independently and express her personality publicly. She became a social media sensation in Pakistan, challenging conservative norms and inspiring other young women to seek freedom. But her courage cost her life, and the way she was killed and how her family reacted will show you how far some people are willing to go to maintain control over women and girls. You'll discover how honor crimes continue happening in broad daylight around the world, protected by inadequate laws and cultures that value family reputation more than human lives. And you'll understand why Kandil's story is both an individual tragedy and a symbol of a much larger struggle that millions of women face every day. Don't miss watching to understand how these crimes continue destroying lives and how the courage of a 26-year-old continues inspiring changes even after her death. Her story will show you that the fight for women's and children's rights is far from over, and that each of us has a role to play in ensuring that tragedies like Ayu's and Kandil's never happen again. Share this video in your groups and social networks. The more people know about these terrible realities, the more pressure we'll create to make cases like Ayu's impossible. We can't change what happened to her, but we can use her story to protect other children. Don't let silence continue protecting those who exploit the most vulnerable. Change begins when we stop ignoring and start acting. Write in the comments which part of Ayu's story impacted you most and what you think needs to be done to end child marriage. Your voices and your outrage are fundamental to maintaining pressure on governments and organizations that still don't do enough to protect children like Ayu.